Long ago, Buddhist monks discovered something profound. The peace we search for in 1,000 places is actually closer than we think. It has been here all along, patiently waiting for us to discover it. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. Tonight, you will hear stories that have traveled across centuries, passed from teacher to student in quiet moments. These are not puzzles to solve or wisdom to memorize. They are gentle mirrors that reflect back something you already know but may have forgotten. The masters who lived these teachings understood that truth cannot be grasped with effort or captured through striving. So there is nothing for you to do tonight except listen. Let your body sink deeper into whatever supports you. Allow your breath to find its own slow rhythm. These stories work best when received the way earth receives rain, without resistance, without trying to hold on to every drop. Some will speak to you clearly. Others will simply pass through, doing their quiet work beneath your awareness. There is no destination we are rushing toward, no goal to achieve before sleep finds you. So settle in now. Take a slow, deep breath, and let's begin our journey together. In the mountains where mist settles into valleys each evening, there was a temple that overlooked a still pond. The temple had stood for 300 years, its wooden beams dark with age, its gardens tended by generations of monks who understood that caring for the earth was itself a form of meditation. Cherry trees grew along the stone pathways, and in spring their petals would fall like snow onto the temple roof. A monk named Joshin lived at this temple. He had arrived as a young man and stayed for 40 years, learning the rhythms of the place until they became his own rhythms. The other monks said that Joshin moved differently than most people, as if he was never in a hurry but also never wasting time. When he walked through the garden in the morning to tend the flowers, his steps were deliberate and calm. When he prepared tea, his hands moved with a kind of grace that made even simple gestures seem meaningful. But what made Joshin unusual was his relationship with the pond beside the temple. This pond was fed by a spring that emerged from the rocks above, and its water was so clear and still that it reflected everything perfectly. On nights when the moon was full, the reflection was so complete that visitors sometimes had trouble telling which moon was real and which was the reflection. The image in the water seemed as solid and present as the moon itself hanging in the sky. Joshin would often sit by this pond in the early morning or late evening, just watching. Not meditating in any formal way, not seeking anything, just observing how the water held the sky, how it captured clouds and stars and passing birds without effort. The pond taught him something that 40 years of study could not teach. It showed him what it meant to receive without grasping, to hold without clinging, to reflect without distortion. One autumn afternoon, when the air had turned cool and leaves were beginning to change color, an elderly woman arrived at the temple gate. Her name was Fumiko, and everyone in the village knew her as someone who carried worry like other people carried water, constantly and with great effort. Her face showed the lines of decades spent anxious about children, about money, about what people thought, about everything that could go wrong and often did. She found Joshin kneeling beside a bed of chrysanthemums, pulling weeds with careful attention. She stood watching him for a moment, noticing how he seemed completely absorbed in this simple task, as if there was nothing else in the world but these flowers and these weeds and this moment of caring for them. "Joshin," she said finally, and he looked up with a face so open and present that she almost forgot what she had come to say. "Fumiko," he said warmly, standing and brushing soil from his hands. "You are welcome here." "I have come many times," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "To this temple, to this pond. Sometimes I sit here for an hour, watching the water and the reflected moon at night. And while I am here, I feel something I almost never feel. A kind of quiet. A kind of peace that makes everything else seem far away." She paused, her hands twisting the edge of her shawl. "But then I return home. Back to my house, to my daily life, to all the problems and worries that wait for me. And within an hour, sometimes within minutes, that peace is completely gone. It vanishes like morning mist. I am back in my usual state, anxious and troubled, my mind spinning with worry." She looked at him with eyes that held both hope and desperation. "What can I do? How can I carry this peace with me when I leave this place? Because if I cannot, then what is the point? I cannot live at the temple. I have a life, responsibilities. But that life feels like drowning, and this place is the only time I can breathe." Joshin listened to all of this without interrupting, his attention complete. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, as if considering something carefully. Then he stood and gestured toward the pond. "Come with me," he said simply. They walked together along the stone path to the edge of the water. It was late afternoon, and though the moon was not yet visible in the sky, the pond reflected everything around it with perfect clarity. The trees, the temple roof, the darkening sky, all of it captured in the still surface. Joshin knelt by the water's edge, and Fumiko knelt beside him. He reached down and picked up a smooth stone from the bank, about the size of a plum. He held it up so she could see it clearly. "Watch," he said. He tossed the stone gently into the center of the pond. It landed with a soft splash, and immediately the surface erupted into ripples. Circles spread outward from where the stone had entered, overlapping and interfering with each other. The perfect reflection of the trees and sky shattered into fragments. Everything that had been clear became confused and broken. The surface that had been a mirror became chaos. "Look," Joshin said softly. "When the surface is disturbed, the reflection breaks apart. The trees seem to shatter. The sky seems to tear into pieces. But what is actually broken? The trees are still standing. The sky is still whole. Only the surface of the water is disturbed." They sat together in silence, watching. Slowly, very slowly, the ripples began to settle. The circles grew wider and fainter, their energy dissipating. The water started to calm, and gradually the reflection returned. First vague shapes, then clearer images, and finally the perfect mirror-like surface was restored. The trees stood whole in the water. The sky was complete again. Nothing had actually been broken at all. "The storms of your life," Joshin said, his voice barely louder than the sound of water lapping against the bank, "are like the ripples on this pond. They disturb the surface. They make everything seem fragmented and chaotic. But they do not touch what lies beneath. The depth of the water remains calm even when the surface is wild." Fumiko stared at the now still water, something shifting in her understanding. "You think," Joshin continued, "that peace is something you find here and lose when you leave. But peace is not a thing you can carry like a possession. It is not something that exists in one place and not in another. Peace is what remains when you stop adding to the disturbance." He picked up another stone and held it, Watch again." He threw this stone into the water, and once more the ripples spread across the surface, destroying the reflection. But this time, Fumiko noticed something different. She noticed that the disturbance came from the stone, from the external action. The water itself was not creating the chaos. It was simply responding, and even in responding, it was already beginning to settle. "Your mind is like this water," Joshin said. "By nature, it is still and clear. It reflects reality accurately when it is undisturbed. But life throws stones into it constantly. Problems, fears, memories, worries. Each one creates ripples. And when many stones are thrown quickly, the surface never has a chance to settle. It becomes a constant chaos." He looked at Fumiko directly. "But you are not the ripples. You are the water. The depth of you, the essence of what you are, remains undisturbed no matter what happens on the surface. The practice is not to carry peace from here to there. The practice is to recognize that peace is always present beneath the disturbance, to identify yourself with the depth rather than the surface." Fumiko felt something crack open inside her, as if a door she had not known was closed suddenly swung wide. All these years she had been trying to calm the ripples, to stop the stones from being thrown, to prevent her life from disturbing her peace. But she had never considered that the ripples were just ripples, and beneath them, something else remained constant. "How do I do that?" she asked, her voice small. "How do I find that depth when everything around me is chaos?" "You do not find it," Joshin said. "You recognize it. It is already here. When you notice that you are disturbed, pause. Just for a moment. Notice that there is an awareness watching the disturbance. That awareness is like the depth of the pond. It can observe the ripples without becoming them." He stood, and she stood with him. The water before them was completely still again, reflecting the first stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "The art of presence," Joshin said, "is simply this: to remain aware of the depth even when the surface is wild. Not to stop the ripples, but to know that you are more than the ripples. To let life throw its stones without believing that each splash is who you are." They walked back toward the temple together. Fumiko's mind was full of this new understanding, turning it over, examining it. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that was not the desperate clinging to a temporary peace, but a recognition of something that perhaps could not be lost because it had never been absent. When she left the temple that evening, the first thing that happened was that her neighbor stopped her to complain about a property boundary. The stone had been thrown. The ripples began. But this time, Fumiko noticed something different. She noticed that beneath the irritation and the impulse to argue, there was a space that was not irritated. A quiet depth that was simply watching all of this happen. She did not become suddenly peaceful. The ripples were still there, but she was not drowning in them. She was the water, and the ripples were just something happening on the surface. This story points to something that lives at the heart of Zen Buddhism, the recognition that we are not our disturbances. We spend our lives trying to calm the surface, trying to prevent ripples, trying to keep the water perfectly still. We think that peace means having no problems, no challenges, no difficulties. And so we exhaust ourselves trying to control everything that might disturb us. But the water of the pond does not resist the stone. It does not try to prevent ripples. It simply receives what comes, responds naturally, and returns to stillness when the energy of the disturbance passes. The depth of the water is never troubled by what happens on the surface. In Zen, there is a teaching about the original nature of mind. Before we fill it with stories and beliefs and identifications, the mind is naturally clear and still, like the undisturbed surface of water. It reflects reality accurately without adding anything to it. But then, life begins, and stones start falling. Experiences, conditioning, trauma, all the countless events that create patterns of reactivity. The surface becomes constantly disturbed, and we forget that the depth was ever still. We come to believe that we are the disturbance. We think our anxiety is who we are. We think our anger is who we are. We think our endless thinking is who we are. But these are just ripples. Patterns of energy moving across the surface of something much deeper. Joshin's teaching to Fumiko was not about stopping the ripples. It was about recognizing what watches the ripples. That awareness, that capacity to observe our own disturbance, is itself undisturbed. It is like the depth of the pond, present and calm even when the surface is chaos. This recognition does not make problems disappear. Life will continue to throw stones. But when you identify with the depth rather than the surface, the ripples lose their power to define you. They become something you experience rather than something you are. The reflected moon in the pond is a perfect image for this. The moon itself, hanging in the sky, is never affected by what happens to its reflection in the water. The reflection can be shattered into 1,000 pieces, but the moon remains whole. In the same way, your true nature is never actually disturbed by what happens in your experience. Only your identification with the surface makes you believe you are broken. In the highlands where mountains rise like ancient guardians and morning mist clings to rocky slopes, there was a monastery perched on a steep hillside. The monks there were known for their dedication to meditation and their understanding of the mind's nature. They spent hours in silence, learning to observe the movements of consciousness with the same attention a craftsman brings to delicate work. A monk named Tenzo lived at this monastery. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of presence that drew people to him without him seeking attention. His eyes held a quality that others found comforting, as if he could see what troubled them without judgment. When younger monks came to him with their struggles, he rarely gave advice. Instead, he would ask questions that turned their attention in directions they had not considered. Tenzo had a practice that others found unusual. Every morning before dawn, before meditation, before the day's work began, he would climb the steep path behind the monastery to the top of the nearest hill. This was not a small walk. The path was rocky and difficult, winding through stands of pine and over loose scree where a careless step could mean a painful fall. It took nearly an hour to reach the summit. But Tenzo made this journey every single morning, in all weather. In rain and wind, in the deep cold of winter when ice made the path treacherous, in the heat of summer when the climb left him soaked with sweat. He would reach the top, sit on a flat rock that faced east, and remain there for perhaps 20 minutes. Then he would descend and return to the monastery in time for the morning meal. The younger monks were curious about this practice. Some thought he was doing a special meditation. Others believed he had a secret teaching he was working with. A few thought perhaps he just enjoyed the view. But no one asked him directly because there was something about Tenzo that made people hesitate to question him casually. One autumn, a young monk named Kenji arrived at the monastery. He was bright and eager, the kind of student who asks many questions and wants to understand everything. He had studied Buddhist philosophy at several temples and had an impressive knowledge of sutras and commentaries. But despite all his learning, he was troubled by something he could not name, a restlessness that no amount of study had resolved. He noticed Tenzo's early morning departures immediately, and his curiosity was intense. What was the older monk doing up there? What practice was he engaged in? After 3 weeks of wandering, Kenji decided to follow. One morning, well before dawn, Kenji positioned himself on the path where he could see when Tenzo began his climb. The older monk emerged from the monastery gate just as the first hint of light touched the eastern sky, barely enough illumination to see by. Kenji waited until Tenzo was well ahead, then began following, staying far enough back that he would not be noticed. The climb was harder than Kenji had expected. He was young and fit, but the path demanded careful attention to every step. Several times he nearly turned back, wondering if this was worth the effort. But his curiosity drove him forward. When he finally neared the summit, he slowed and approached carefully, not wanting to disturb whatever practice Tenzo was engaged in. He found a spot behind a large boulder where he could watch without being seen. What he saw confused him. Tenzo was simply sitting. Not in formal meditation posture, but naturally on the flat rock, facing east. His eyes were open, looking out over the valley below where the monastery sat, tiny in the distance. The sky was beginning to brighten, shifting from black to deep blue to a pale grey. Tenzo was not chanting. He was not moving through any formal practice. He was just sitting there, breathing, watching the sky. Kenji waited, expecting something to happen. Some ritual, some practice, some secret teaching to reveal itself. But nothing happened. Tenzo just sat, completely still, his attention on the horizon. Then, slowly, the sun began to rise. The sky turned orange, then pink, then gold. Light spread across the valley like water filling a bowl. The world transformed from shadow into form, from darkness into color. The monastery below became visible, its walls catching the first rays. The trees emerged from the general darkness into individual presences. Birds began to call. And Tenzo sat watching all of this with an attention that was complete but somehow effortless. He was not concentrating hard or trying to see something. He was simply present to what was happening, the way water is present to itself. When the sun had fully cleared the horizon and the day had definitively begun, Tenzo stood, stretched slowly, and began walking back down the path. Kenji stayed hidden until the older monk was well ahead, then followed. His mind was full of questions. What was the point of that? What had Tenzo been doing? Just watching the sunrise? Anyone could do that. Where was the profound practice, the secret teaching? He spent the day troubled by this. He had expected something meaningful, something that would explain Tenzo's devotion to this daily climb. But he had seen nothing that seemed significant. That evening, Kenji found Tenzo working in the garden, tending to the vegetables that would feed the monastery through winter. He approached with the kind of awkward determination of someone who has decided to be bold. "Tenzo," he said, bowing respectfully. "I must confess something. This morning, I followed you to the hilltop." Tenzo looked up from his work, and if he was surprised or bothered by this, he did not show it. He just nodded slightly and returned to examining a squash vine. I wanted to understand your practice, Kenji continued. Why you climb that difficult path every morning? I thought there must be some special meditation you were doing, some teaching I could learn from. And what did you see? Tenzo asked, his attention still on the plants. Nothing, Kenji said, frustration creeping into his voice. You just sat there, watching the sunrise. That is all. Just sitting and watching. Yes, Tenzo said simply. But why? Kenji asked. Why make that difficult climb every day just to watch something happen? The sun rises whether you watch it or not. The day comes whether you are there or not. What is the point? Tenzo set down the tool he was using and gave Kenji his full attention. Tell me, he said. This morning, when you were hiding behind the boulder, watching me watch the sunrise, did you see the sunrise? Kenji opened his mouth to say yes, then stopped. He realized he had been so focused on watching Tenzo, so busy trying to figure out what the practice was, so occupied with his own questions and confusion, that he had barely noticed the sunrise itself. It had happened while he was looking at something else. I see, Kenji said quietly. No, Tenzo said gently. That is the problem. You did not see. You were too busy looking for meaning to notice what was actually present. He stood and brushed dirt from his hands. Come with me tomorrow morning. Not to watch me, but to sit beside me. Let me show you what there is to see. The next morning, well before dawn, Kenji joined Tenzo for the climb. They walked in silence, the older monk moving with the same steady pace as always, Kenji following, trying to match his rhythm. When they reached the summit, Tenzo gestured to a spot next to his usual rock. Sit, he said, and watch. Kenji Saturday. The valley below was invisible in the darkness, just a vast space of shadow. The sky overhead was still scattered with stars, though they were beginning to fade. The air was cold and still. They waited. Kenji's mind filled with its usual activity. Questions about what he was supposed to be learning. Thoughts about his studies. Plans for the day. Memories of yesterday. His attention bounced around like a bird in a cage, landing nowhere, constantly moving. But gradually, something shifted. Perhaps it was the cold air on his face. Perhaps it was the vast silence of the mountains. Perhaps it was Tenzo's stillness beside him, deep and unwavering like the stillness of old stone. Whatever it was, Kenji's thinking began to quiet. And into that quiet space, the world began to reveal itself. He noticed the exact moment when the quality of darkness changed, a subtle shift he would have missed if his mind had been busy. He noticed how the stars did not simply vanish, but faded incrementally, each one holding on as long as it could before surrendering to the growing light. He noticed the precise instant when he could first distinguish the shape of the mountains against the sky, as if they were emerging from non-existence into form. The sky turned colors he had never really seen before, even though he had seen countless sunrises. Deep indigo melting into violet, violet bleeding into rose, rose giving way to gold. Each shade appeared and transformed in its own time, following a rhythm that was both infinitely patient and completely unstoppable. And then the sun itself appeared, not all at once, but gradually, a curve of brightness that grew until it became a complete circle. The light spread down the mountains like a slow wave, touching the upper slopes first, then flowing down into the valleys, bringing each thing into visibility as it passed. Kenji felt something crack open inside him. It was not a thought or a realization in the usual sense. It was more like a remembering or a recognition. He had been so busy his entire life looking for something meaningful, searching for some profound truth that would explain everything, that he had missed what was actually here. The simple, immediate, complete reality of just this moment, just this sunrise, just this breath of cold air, and this feeling of being alive and present. Tears came to his eyes, unexpected and unstoppable. Not sad tears, but tears of something else. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude, or the strange emotion that comes when we realize we have been carrying a burden we could have set down long ago. When the sun was fully risen and the day had begun, Tenzo stood. He looked at Kenji, saw the wetness on his face, and smiled. "So," he said, "you saw it this time." "I saw it," Kenji confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "And what was it you saw?" Kenji thought about this carefully. "I saw that I have been looking past everything my whole life, searching for something hidden, something special, something more meaningful than what was right in front of me. And in doing that, I missed everything that was actually here." Tenzo nodded. "Yes. The thinking mind is like a cloud that covers the Sunday. It is not malicious. It is just doing what clouds do. But when it covers everything, we forget that the light is still there. We just cannot see it through the obscurity of our own constant thinking." They began the descent together, and this time Kenji noticed 1,000 things he had missed on previous walks. The way the light fell through the pine needles. The sound of small creatures moving in the undergrowth. The smell of the earth and the particular quality of the morning air. All of it had always been there, but he had been too lost in his thoughts to notice. "Every morning," Tenzo said as they walked, "I climb this hill. Not because the sunrise is special, but because I need to remember. The thinking mind is persistent. Every day it builds new clouds. Every day it tries to cover the simple presence of reality with its stories and questions and meanings. And every day I need to clear those clouds away and see directly what is here." "Is that what Zen practice is?" Kenji asked. "Zen practice," Tenzo said, "is learning to see through the clouds, to recognize when your thinking is obscuring your direct experience. The sunrise is a good teacher for this because it does not wait for you to understand it. It does not care if you have profound thoughts about it. It just happens with or without your comprehension. And in its simple happening, it shows you what direct experience is like when the clouds part." The teaching here speaks to something we all experience, but rarely recognize. We live most of our lives lost in thought, in the cloud layer of the mind, and we mistake that cloud layer for reality itself. We think our thoughts about our experience are the same as the experience. We think our judgments, our interpretations, our stories about what is happening are what is actually happening. But Zen points to something different. It points to the possibility of direct experience, unfiltered by the constant commentary of thought. When Kenji first followed Tenzo, he was so busy trying to figure out what it all meant that he missed the actual event. His thinking covered the sunrise like a cloud covers the Sunday. This is how we live. Something beautiful happens, and we are busy photographing it or thinking about what it means or comparing it to other beautiful things. Someone speaks to us, and we are busy formulating our response or judging what they are saying, or thinking about something else entirely. The present moment unfolds, and we are lost in thoughts about the past or fantasies about the future. The clouds are not evil. Thinking is not wrong. The mind creates these clouds naturally as part of what it does. But when we never see past the clouds, when we never recognize that there is a direct reality beyond our thoughts about reality, we live in a kind of blindness. We experience our interpretations rather than what is actually here. When Kenji finally sat still enough for his thinking to quiet, the world revealed itself. Not a different world, but the same world seen without the constant filter of interpretation. The sunrise was not more beautiful because he was present to it. It was always that beautiful. But now he could actually see it because his clouds had temporarily parted. This is available to all of us in any moment. Not just during sunrises on mountains, but here, now, wherever you are. The thinking will continue. The clouds will keep forming. But between the thoughts, in the gaps, there is direct contact with reality. A sound happens, and for a split second before you name it or judge it, there is just the pure experience of the sound. A sensation arises in your body, and before you label it or make a story about it, there is just the direct feeling of it. These gaps are like the sunrise breaking through the clouds. Brief moments when you experience life directly, rather than through the filter of thought. And the practice, as Tenzo showed, is simply to notice these moments. To recognize when the clouds part. To see that there is a difference between thinking about your life and actually living it. Along the coast where fishing boats returned each evening with their catch, there was a village painted in soft colors that had faded from years of salt air, and Sunday, the houses faced the water, and in the mornings, the smell of the sea mixed with the smoke from cooking fires. At the edge of this village, in a small dwelling made of weathered wood, lived an old Zen teacher named Sorin. Sorin had lived by the sea for so long that people said he could read the water like others read books. He knew when storms would come by watching the horizon. He knew the tides by some inner clock that needed no reference. The fishermen respected him, though he was not a fisherman himself. He simply understood the rhythms of the ocean in a way that felt natural to him. One spring afternoon, a young woman named Ayame arrived in the village. She had traveled a long way, following stories she had heard about Sorin's wisdom. She was perhaps 25 years old, with intelligent eyes that held a question she could not quite name. She had studied at a university in the city, then worked in various positions, then traveled to different places, always searching for something that seemed just out of reach. She found Sorin sitting on the small dock behind his house, mending a fishing net that belonged to one of the village fishermen. His hands moved with practiced ease through the knots and repairs, not hurrying but not wasting any motion. "Teacher Sorin," she said, bowing respectfully, "I have come seeking guidance. I feel as though I do not know myself. I have tried many paths, studied many things, but I still feel uncertain about who I truly am beneath all the roles I have played." Sorin looked up from his work, studying her with calm attention. He saw a young person carrying the weight of many expectations, many ideas about who she should be, many voices in her head telling her what would make her valuable or worthy or successful. "Come with me," he said simply, setting down the net. He led her along the shore to where a small boat was pulled up on the sand. It was a simple wooden boat, old but well maintained, with 2 oars resting inside. Without explanation, he pushed the boat into the shallow water and gestured for her to climb in. She hesitated only a moment before stepping carefully into the boat and sitting on the narrow bench. Soren climbed in with surprising ease for his age and began to row. The movement was smooth and steady, each stroke of the oars sending them further from shore. Ayame watched the village grow smaller behind them, the houses becoming tiny dots of color against the green hills. They rowed for perhaps half an hour until the shore seemed far away and the ocean spread around them in every direction. The water was calm, moving in long, slow swells that lifted and lowered the boat in a gentle rhythm. Seabirds called overhead, and the sun was warm on Ayame's face. Then Soren stopped rowing. He pulled the oars into the boat and sat quietly, looking around at the vast expanse of water and sky. Ahead of them, perhaps 200 meters distant, a small island rose from the sea. It was barely large enough to be called an island, just a rocky outcrop with a few hardy plants growing in the crevices and a single twisted tree that had somehow found purchase in the stone. No one lived there. It was too small, too exposed to the weather. But it existed, solid and real, in the middle of all that water. "That island," Soren said, pointing. "You will stay there for 3 days." Ayame felt surprise rise in her chest. "Stay there?" "But there is nothing there. No shelter, no food." "There is rock and sky and water," Soren said. "There is yourself." "That will be enough." He reached into a bag he had brought and pulled out a water flask and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Water for 3 days. Some rice and dried fish. Enough to keep you alive, but not comfortable. He rowed closer to the island, and when the water was shallow enough, Ayame stepped out onto the rocks, holding the flask and the food bundle. The boat scraped against stone. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, feeling uncertain about being left alone in such a place. "You said you do not know yourself," Soren replied. "Here, there is nothing to distract you from finding out. No roles to play. No one to impress. No schedules or obligations or expectations. Just you and the simple fact of being alive in this place for 3 days." He pushed the boat back into deeper water. "I will return on the morning of the 4th day. Until then, just be here. Watch the water. Watch the sky. Watch your own mind. See what remains when everything else is stripped away." Then he was rowing back toward the village, and Ayame was alone on the small island with only the sound of waves against rock and the cry of gulls wheeling overhead. The first hours were difficult. Her mind raced with questions and reactions. What was she supposed to do here? How was this supposed to help? What if something went wrong? She walked the perimeter of the island, which took only a few minutes. She found a relatively flat area among the rocks where she could sit without too much discomfort. She ate a small portion of the rice, trying to make it last. As the sun moved across the sky and afternoon turned to evening, something began to shift. With nothing to do, nowhere to go, no one to talk to, Ayame's thinking gradually ran out of fuel. The constant stream of thoughts that normally filled her awareness began to slow. Not because she was trying to stop thinking, but simply because there was nothing new to think about. She noticed the sound of the water more clearly. The way each wave had its own character, its own rhythm. The way the light changed as the sun lowered toward the horizon, turning the sea from blue to silver to gold. The way the wind felt on her skin, sometimes warm, sometimes cool, never exactly the same from moment to moment. Night came, and with no fire and no shelter, she simply lay on the rock, looking up at more stars than she had ever seen in the city. The vastness of the sky was overwhelming at first, making her feel small and insignificant. But as she continued to look, something in that feeling shifted. She was small, yes, but she was also here, present, aware of the stars and the darkness and the sound of the endless water. The second day brought a different quality of experience. Her thinking had quieted even more, and in that quiet, she began to notice things about herself she had never seen before. Patterns of thought that ran automatically. Beliefs she had never questioned. Stories she told herself about who she was and what she was worth. She saw how much of her identity was borrowed from others. Ideas her parents had given her about what made a person valuable. Standards her teachers had set for success. Comparisons she made constantly with friends and strangers. She had been carrying all of this like a heavy pack, assuming it was who she was, never realizing it was just weight she had picked up along the way. Sitting on the rock in the middle of the sea, with no one watching, no one judging, no expectations or obligations, Ayame felt something release. It was as if layers of accumulated identity were peeling away, revealing something simpler underneath. Not a new identity, but something more basic. Just the fact of awareness itself. The simple experience of being alive and present. She realized she had been looking for herself in the wrong places. She had been searching for an identity that would feel complete and satisfying, trying on different roles and paths like trying on clothes, hoping one of them would fit. But what she found here, in the silence and solitude, was that beneath all those roles and identities, there was just this. Just awareness experiencing itself. Just being here, breathing, feeling, seeing. It was not dramatic or mystical. It was actually quite ordinary. But in its ordinariness, it felt more real than anything she had experienced before. This simple presence did not need to prove anything or become anything or achieve anything. It just was. On the third day, she felt different than when she had arrived. Lighter somehow. As if she had set down a burden she did not know she was carrying. When thoughts arose about her future or her past, she noticed them but did not get pulled into them the way she usually did. They were just thoughts, moving through like clouds, moving through sky. When Soren's boat appeared on the morning of the fourth day, Ayame stood on the rocks feeling a kind of gratitude she could not quite express in words. She climbed into the boat, and they rowed back toward the village in comfortable silence. Finally, as the shore grew closer, Soren spoke. "How do you feel?" "Different," Ayame said. "Clearer. I cannot explain it exactly, but something has changed. I came here looking for myself, thinking I needed to discover some hidden identity. But what I found was simpler than that. I found that when I stop trying to be someone, there is still something here. A presence, an awareness. And that is enough." Soren smiled, his weathered face creasing with warmth. Each of us has an island like this inside. A place of simplicity where we can strip away all the accumulated layers and see what remains. You do not need to travel to an actual island to find it. You just need to recognize that beneath all the noise and activity, beneath all the roles you play and identities you carry, there is this simple awareness that needs nothing added to it. The boat scraped against the sand of the shore, and they climbed out. Ayame turned to look back at the small island, already distant in the morning light. The world will try to cover that simple awareness again, Soren said gently. Life will pile new expectations and obligations and identities on top of it. But now you know it is there. You know you can return to that island, that place of simplicity, whenever you need to remember what you are beneath everything else. This teaching about the island within ourselves points to something central in Zen Buddhism, the recognition that our true nature is not found in adding more to ourselves, but in removing what obscures it. We spend so much energy trying to build an identity, to become someone impressive or worthy or complete. But underneath all that building, there is already something present. Simple awareness, basic being, the fact of consciousness itself. Ayame's experience on the island was not about gaining something new. It was about seeing what remained when the usual distractions fell away. With no one to impress, no roles to perform, no way to distract herself from simple presence, she could finally see past all the accumulated ideas about who she should be and recognize what she actually was. In Zen, there is a teaching about original face, the self we were before we learned language, before we accumulated beliefs and identities, before we became complicated with all our stories. This is not a special or mystical self. It is just the basic awareness that is always present, usually hidden beneath layers of thinking and identifying. The island Soren sent Ayame to was a place where those layers could not maintain themselves. Without social interaction, without tasks and obligations, without the usual ways we reinforce our sense of self, the constructed identity began to dissolve. And what remained was not nothing. It was presence itself. Awareness experiencing itself. Simple being. We do not need to go to an actual island to touch this. It is available in any moment when we stop trying to be someone and simply notice what it is like to be aware right now. In the gap between thoughts. In the direct experience of breathing. In the simple fact of being here, whoever or whatever this here turns out to be. In a valley where rivers ran cold and clear from mountain snow, there was a village built along the banks of a wide stream. The houses were made of river stone and timber, and gardens grew wherever the land was flat enough to plant. A Zen monk named Shinzen had built a small hermitage on the edge of this village, and people would come to him with their questions about practice and life. Shinzen was known for his way of teaching through nature. He rarely answered questions directly. Instead, he would take students to the river, or into the forest, or up into the hills, and show them something in the natural world that contained the answer they sought. Those who studied with him learned to see teaching everywhere, in the way water moved over stones, in how trees bent in wind, in the endless variations of the changing seasons. One afternoon in late summer, a young man named Daiki came to Shinzen's hermitage. He was in his early 30s, with an intensity about him that suggested someone who thought deeply about things. He had been practicing meditation for several years and had some understanding of Buddhist teachings, but something troubled him. Shinzen welcomed him with tea, and they sat in the simple room looking out at the garden where late summer flowers were beginning to fade into autumn. "Teacher," Daiki said, his hands wrapped around the warm teacup, "I find myself resisting change. I understand intellectually that everything is impermanent, that change is natural and unavoidable. But emotionally, I keep trying to hold on to things. When something good happens, I want to freeze it in place. When something difficult arises, I want to push it away. I exhaust myself with this constant resistance, but I do not know how to stop." Shinzen listened quietly, his attention complete. When Daiki finished, The teacher stood and gestured toward the door. "Walk with me," he said. They left the hermitage and walked through the village, past houses where people were beginning to prepare evening meals, past gardens where late vegetables were being harvested. They walked until they reached the river that ran through the valley, wide and strong with late summer flow. The riverbank was covered with stones of all sizes, from pebbles to boulders larger than a person. The water moved around these stones, creating patterns of current and eddy, sounds of gurgling and rushing. Shinzen led Daiki to a place where the bank was flat and easy to walk on. He bent down and picked up a smooth river stone, about the size of his palm, dark grey and polished by countless years of water flowing over it. "This stone," Shinzen said, holding it so Daiki could see clearly. "How long has it been in this river?" "Many years," Daiki said. "Perhaps hundreds of years. And in all that time, the water has been flowing over it, around it, against it. Day after day, year after year. The stone sits here, solid and unchanging in its essential nature. The water flows, constantly moving, never the same from one moment to the next. Watch." He waded into the shallow edge of the river and placed the stone gently in the current. The water immediately began to flow around it, creating small patterns of movement, swirling and eddying. The stone remained still while the water moved. "What do you notice?" Shinzen asked. Daiki watched for a moment. The water adapts to the stone. It does not try to move it or push it out of the way. It simply flows around it, accepting the stone as part of its path. "Yes, and the stone?" "The stone sits there. It does not try to stop the water or redirect it. It just remains itself while the water flows around it." Shinzen nodded. Neither fights the other. The stone does not resist the water's flow. The water does not resist the stone's presence. They exist together without conflict. He waded back to shore and gestured for Daiki to follow him upstream a short distance to where the river narrowed and the current became stronger. Here, larger stones created more dramatic patterns in the water, white foam and turbulence marking where the current met solid rock. "Here the flow is stronger," Shinzen said. "The force of the water is greater. But still, the stone does not resist. It allows the water to move how the water moves, and the water shapes itself around the stone without struggle." They stood watching the play of water and stone, the endless variations of movement and stillness, change and permanence. "You are both," Shinzen said quietly. "You are the stone, rooted in your essential nature, the awareness that remains constant through all changes. And you are also the water, flowing and changing, moving through circumstances that are never the same twice." He picked up another stone, smaller this time, and tossed it into the current. It landed with a splash and disappeared beneath the surface. The water accepted it, incorporated it, flowed on. "When you resist change," Shinzen continued, "you are like a stone trying to stop the water's flow. It is exhausting and impossible. The water will flow whether the stone wants it to or not. But when you see that you are also the water, that change is your nature as much as stability is, then there is no conflict." Daiki felt something shift in his understanding, though he could not quite put it into words yet. "But how do I practice this? How do I be both stone and water?" Shinzen smiled. "You already are both. The practice is simply recognizing it, When change comes, notice the part of you that wants to resist. That is natural. But also notice the part of you that is aware of the change, that can observe your own resistance without being overwhelmed by it. That awareness is like the stone, stable and unchanged even as emotions and circumstances flow around it. He bent down and ran his hand through the water, letting it slip through his fingers. And when you feel solid and fixed in your ways, notice how your experience is actually flowing and changing moment to moment. Your thoughts change. Your feelings change. Your body sensations change. You are always in motion, like the water, even when you feel still. They walked back along the river toward the village, and with each step, Daiki found himself noticing the interplay of stability and change around him. The solid earth beneath his feet, the changing light as the sun lowered toward the horizon, his steady breathing, his shifting thoughts. "One more thing," Shinzen said as they neared the hermitage. "Did you notice how smooth the stone was?" That smoothness came from the water. Over countless years, the flowing water has polished the stone, worn away the rough edges. The water changes the stone, but gradually, gently. The stone is shaped by what flows around it. He stopped and turned to face Daiki directly. "Your difficulties, your changes, your losses and gains, all of this flowing through your life, it shapes you. Not by breaking you, but by gradually wearing away what is not essential, revealing the smoother, clearer being underneath. When you resist this, you keep your rough edges. When you allow it, you become polished like river stone." Daiki bowed deeply to his teacher. Something in him had relaxed, though he knew he would need to remember this teaching many times as life continued to flow and change around him. The understanding Shinzen offered through the river and stones speaks to one of the central challenges we all face: how to remain stable in ourselves while also being flexible enough to move with life's changes. We often believe we must choose one or the other. Either we are firm and unchanging, holding our ground no matter what, or we are flexible and adaptive, going with every flow. But this is a false choice. The river teaches something different. The stone maintains its essential nature while allowing the water to flow around it. The water flows freely while accepting the presence of the stone in its path. Neither needs to destroy the other. Neither needs to deny the other's existence. They coexist naturally, each doing what it does, without conflict. In Zen, there is a teaching about being like bamboo in wind. The bamboo has strong roots, grounded deeply. But its trunk and branches are flexible, bending with the wind rather than resisting it. The tree that is too rigid breaks in the storm. The tree with no roots gets pulled away. But the bamboo, rooted yet flexible, survives by being both. When Daiki spoke of resisting change, he was describing something we all do. We want good moments to last forever. We want difficult situations to end immediately. We create suffering by fighting against the basic nature of reality, which is that everything changes. Nothing remains frozen in place. Life flows like water, whether we want it to or not. But the teaching is not to simply give up and be swept away by every change. The stone has its place. There is something in us that can remain stable and grounded even as circumstances change. This is awareness itself. The part of us that can observe change without being destroyed by it. The presence that remains even as thoughts and emotions and situations flow through our experience. the image of the smooth stone is particularly important. The rough edges are worn away gradually by the water's constant flow. This is how life works on us. Each experience, each difficulty, each loss and gain slowly wears away our rough edges. The parts of us that are not essential gradually get polished away, revealing something smoother and clearer underneath. When we resist this process, we keep our rough edges. We stay rigid and uncomfortable, scraped raw by the flow of life. But when we allow the process, when we stop resisting every change and loss, we are slowly shaped into something more refined. Not broken down, but polished. Not destroyed, but revealed. This is the wisdom of the river, showing us how to live with both roots and flexibility, both stability and flow, both the unchanging awareness at our core and the constant change of our lived experience. In a valley where stone houses clustered together like old friends, there lived a Zen master named Kenzo. His dwelling was simple, just 2 rooms at the edge of the village, where he could see both the settlement below and the mountains rising above. People said that Kenzo had a quality of completeness about him, as if he carried no inner division, no war between different parts of himself. A young woman named Hana came to his door one evening, just as the sun was setting and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. She was perhaps 28 years old, with a face that showed both intelligence and a certain weariness. She had been struggling with something for a long time, and it had brought her finally to Kenzo's threshold. "Master Kenzo," she said after they had exchanged greetings and he had offered her tea, "I am divided against myself. There are parts of me that I love and celebrate, qualities I am proud of. My kindness, my creativity, my ability to connect with others. But there are other parts I despise. My jealousy when others succeed. My pettiness over small slights. My capacity for judgment and criticism. I try to strengthen the good parts and eliminate the bad parts, but the bad parts never go away. I feel like I am in a constant battle with myself, and I am so tired of fighting." Kenzo listened with complete attention, his eyes gentle and understanding. When she finished speaking, he stood and gestured toward the door. "Come outside with me," he said. "There is something I want to show you." They walked out into the evening air, now cool with the approach of night. The sky was in that transitional state where day and night exist together, the sun having just disappeared below the horizon, but its light still coloring the western sky in bands of orange and deep purple. In the east, the moon was rising, nearly full, its silver light already bright enough to cast shadows. Kenzo stood looking up at the sky, and Hana stood beside him, following his gaze. "Tell me what you see," he said simply. "I see the end of day and the beginning of night," Hana replied. "The sun's light fading in the west, the moon rising in the east. Do you see how they coexist?" Kenzo asked. "The warmth of the sun's fading light and the cool brilliance of the moon's rising, both present at the same moment, neither cancelling out the other." Hana nodded, though she was not yet sure where this observation was leading. "Once," Kenzo began, his voice taking on the quality of someone telling an old story, "the sun and the moon had a conversation. This was long ago, when the world was younger and celestial beings still spoke with each other about their roles in the great turning of time." He paused, and in that pause, the evening deepened slightly, the sun's light fading another degree, the moon's presence growing stronger. "The sun was feeling very proud of itself," Kenzo continued. "It said to the moon, 'Look at what I do. I bring warmth to the world. I make plants grow and give life to everything. I bring light and clarity. Without me, the world would be cold and dark and lifeless. I am essential. Hana smiled slightly, recognizing something human in this celestial pride. The moon listened quietly. Kenzo went on. Then it replied, "But son, you do not know the beauty of darkness. You do not understand the peace that comes with night. You have never seen the stars, which can only shine when you are gone. There are flowers that bloom only at night, creatures that live their entire lives under my light. There are truths that can only be discovered in darkness, depths that can only be plumbed when your brightness is not overwhelming everything." The master's voice was soft but clear in the gathering dusk. The son had never considered this. It had always thought darkness was simply the absence of light, something to be overcome or eliminated. It had not understood that darkness itself had value, that night was not inferior to day but different, necessary, complete in its own way. He turned to look at Hana directly. Both the sun and the moon have their place in the pattern of time. The sun brings vitality and growth. The moon brings rest and reflection. Day allows us to work and build and see clearly. Night allows us to dream and restore and see in different ways. Neither is complete without the other. The world needs both. Something stirred in Hana's understanding, though she had not yet grasped the full teaching. "You speak of fighting against parts of yourself," Kenzo said. "Of trying to eliminate qualities you consider bad while keeping only the qualities you consider good. But this is like the sun trying to eliminate the moon, or day trying to prevent night from ever coming. It goes against the basic nature of how things are." He gestured to the sky where both the last light of sun and the bright light of moon coexisted. "Your jealousy and your kindness are both parts of you. Your judgment and your compassion exist together. The parts you despise are not separate from the parts you celebrate. They are aspects of the same wholeness, like day and night are aspects of the same turning of time." Hana felt a resistance rising in her. "But surely some qualities are better than others? Surely kindness is preferable to jealousy? Compassion to judgment? Is night preferable to day?" Kenzo asked gently. "Or is each simply what it is, serving its purpose in the larger pattern? Your jealousy shows you what you value. Your judgment reveals your standards and expectations. Even the qualities you despise carry information, show you something about yourself, have their role in the complete picture of who you are." They stood in silence as the evening continued to deepen. The sun's light was now just a thin band of color on the horizon. The moon had risen higher, its light growing stronger as the day's light faded. "The practice is not to eliminate parts of yourself," Kenzo said. "The practice is to see the whole. To recognize that you are like the sky, large enough to hold both sun and moon, day and night, light and shadow. When you stop dividing yourself into good parts and bad parts, when you stop fighting against half of your own nature, you discover a kind of peace that comes from being whole." Hana thought about this for a long time, watching as the last of the sun's light disappeared and the night became complete. The moon now ruled the sky, bright and clear, casting silver light across the valley. "But how do I accept the parts I have spent years trying to change?" she asked finally. "How do I stop fighting when fighting has become my habit?" "Start by noticing," Kenzo said. When jealousy arises, instead of immediately judging it as bad and trying to push it away, simply notice it. Ah, jealousy is here. What is it showing me? What do I value that makes this jealousy possible? When judgment arises, instead of feeling ashamed of being judgmental, simply observe. Ah, judgment is here. What standard am I holding that makes this judgment appear? He turned to face her fully. The moon does not apologize for being cool instead of warm. The night does not feel ashamed for being dark. They simply are what they are, serving their role. In the same way, each aspect of you, even the ones you dislike, is simply part of the complete pattern. When you stop fighting them, they stop being problems. They become just aspects of your nature, arising and passing according to conditions, no more significant than the turning of day into night. Hana felt something release inside her, as if a fist that had been clenched for years was finally opening. She had spent so much energy fighting against herself, trying to be only light with no shadow, only day with no night. And that fighting had exhausted her, leaving her divided and incomplete. So I am both, she said quietly. Both sun and moon. Both day and night. Both the qualities I love and the qualities I struggle with. And the peace comes not from winning the fight, but from ending it? Yes, Kenzo said simply. You are the whole sky, large enough to hold everything. They stood together in the moonlight, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Hana felt a kind of unity within herself. Not because the difficult parts had disappeared, but because she had stopped making them into enemies. This teaching about sun and moon, about embracing our whole nature rather than fighting against parts of ourselves, touches on something profound in Zen Buddhism. We create so much internal conflict by dividing ourselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts, then spending enormous energy trying to eliminate what we judge as wrong or bad. But Zen points to a different possibility. What if all aspects of our nature are simply aspects, like day and night are both aspects of time? What if our difficult qualities are not flaws to be removed, but information to be understood, energy to be worked with, parts of the complete picture? The sun in the story represents our sunny disposition, the parts of ourselves we are proud of and comfortable showing to others. These are real and valuable. But the sun does not see the stars. It cannot know what reveals itself only in darkness. Similarly, if we only accept our pleasant qualities, we miss what can be learned from our shadow side. The moon represents qualities that emerge in darkness, in the hidden parts of ourselves. These are not inferior to day qualities. They are simply different, serving different purposes. The person who never feels jealousy might also never know what they deeply value. The person who never judges might also never develop discernment. Even our difficult qualities carry wisdom when we learn to see them clearly rather than fighting against them. When we stop fighting ourselves, when we recognize that we are large enough to contain both light and shadow, something remarkable happens. The qualities we struggled against often lose their power over us. They become less problematic precisely because we are no longer in conflict with them. Like the moon that simply is what it is without apologizing for not being the sun, our difficult aspects become just part of the weather of our inner life, arising and passing according to conditions. High in the mountains where snow remained on the peaks even in summer, there was a hermitage so remote that only the most dedicated seekers would make the journey to reach it. The path climbed through forests of pine that gradually thinned into rocky slopes where only the hardiest plants could grow. At the highest point accessible before the eternal snows began, a small stone dwelling stood, barely visible against the mountain itself. A monk named Riku had lived in this hermitage for 7 years. He had come seeking solitude, seeking to understand his own mind through intensive practice, away from the distractions of the world below. His days followed a simple rhythm: meditation, simple meals, tending to basic needs, more meditation. The silence of the mountains had taught him much, but there was something he had not yet penetrated, a barrier within himself that remained frozen despite years of practice. One winter morning, Riku woke to find the world transformed by snow. It had fallen during the night, deep and silent, covering everything in white. The small lake below his hermitage, which had been partially frozen for weeks, was now completely solid, its surface a perfect sheet of ice covered by a layer of fresh snow. Riku looked at this lake and felt it as a mirror of his own inner state. For all his years of practice, for all his meditation and insight, there were parts of himself he could not access, memories he could not face, emotions he had frozen rather than feeling. He had achieved a kind of peace, but it was the peace of numbness, of keeping everything at a distance, not the peace of genuine openness. Something in him knew it was time. Time to cross the frozen lake, literally and figuratively. Time to face what he had been avoiding. He wrapped himself in his warmest robes and began the descent to the lake. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the cold air burned in his lungs. But he continued, step by step, until he stood at the lake's edge. The ice was thick and solid, covered by snow that had fallen soft and deep. Another hermitage stood on the far shore, abandoned now but still intact, a place where monks had lived generations ago. Riku had never crossed to visit it. The lake in summer was too difficult to navigate, and in winter he had always found reasons not to make the crossing. But those reasons, he now understood, were just fear dressed as practicality. He took his first step onto the ice. Even through the snow covering, he could feel how solid it was, how unyielding. The surface held his weight easily, but each step felt tentative, as if at any moment the solid could become fragile. As he walked, Riku became aware of something. This ice beneath his feet was like the barrier he had built inside himself. Solid, seemingly protective, keeping things separated. The lake's water was still there, still fluid beneath the frozen surface, but locked away, inaccessible. He thought about the grief he had never fully allowed himself to feel when his mother died. He had been young, just beginning his training, and he had channeled everything into practice, using discipline as a way to avoid the rawness of loss. The grief had frozen, locked beneath the surface, and he had built his life on top of it. He thought about the anger he carried toward his father, who had expected him to take over the family business and had seen his choice to become a monk as a betrayal. That anger had never been expressed, never been worked through. Just frozen, kept at a distance where it could not burn him. He thought about his fear of intimacy, his difficulty connecting deeply with others, choosing remote hermitages and solitary practice because relationships felt too risky, too unpredictable. That fear was frozen too, solid and seemingly immovable. With each step across the ice, these recognitions became clearer. He was not just crossing a frozen lake. He was acknowledging the frozen places within himself, the emotions and experiences he had locked away rather than allowing himself to fully feel. Halfway across, Riku stopped. The hermitage on the far shore seemed very distant. The hermitage behind him was disappearing into the falling snow. He stood in the middle of the frozen lake, surrounded by whiteness, and felt the full weight of what he had been carrying. Then something unexpected happened. As he stood there in the cold, breathing the sharp air, fully present to this moment of crossing, he felt warmth. Not physical warmth, but something else. A warmth that came from his own attention, from his own willingness to finally face what he had been avoiding. He noticed that his breath, visible in the cold air, was warm. Each exhale created a small cloud of warmth that dissipated into the surrounding cold. This breath came from inside him, from his living body, from the warmth of being alive and present. He knelt down on the ice and swept away some of the snow. The ice beneath was clear enough that he could see shadows and shapes below, the water still there, still existing beneath the frozen surface. Not gone, just temporarily held in a different form. Riku understood something then. The ice of his emotional barriers was not as solid as he thought. His own warm attention, the willingness to be present to what he had frozen, could begin to melt it. Not violently, not by breaking or shattering, but gradually, the way spring eventually comes even to the highest mountains. He continued his crossing, and with each step, he brought his attention to the frozen places within. Not trying to force anything, not demanding that they melt immediately, just acknowledging them. Breathing warmth onto them with his awareness. Letting them know they no longer needed to stay frozen for his protection. When he reached the far shore and stepped onto solid ground, he looked back across the lake. He had crossed it. The barrier that had seemed so absolute, so permanent, was just ice. Solid, yes, but not eternal. Subject to conditions. Capable of transformation. He explored the abandoned hermitage briefly, finding it peaceful in its emptiness. But the real discovery had happened during the crossing itself, during those moments of walking across his own frozen places with conscious awareness and willingness to feel. The return journey was different. He knew the ice would hold him now. He knew that his frozen barriers, while still present, were not as impenetrable as he had believed. The warmth of awareness was patient but persistent, and over time, even the oldest ice could melt. Back in his hermitage, Riku sat in meditation with a new understanding. For years he had thought his peace came from keeping things at a distance, from maintaining the ice. But true peace, he now saw, would come from allowing the thaw, from feeling what needed to be felt, facing what needed to be faced, letting the frozen waters of his inner life flow again. It would not happen all at once. The ice had taken years to form, and it would take time to melt. But he had taken the first step. He had crossed the frozen lake, acknowledging what lay beneath. And in that acknowledgement, the process of thawing had already begun. The teaching of the frozen lake speaks to something many of us experience, the way we freeze parts of ourselves as a form of protection. When experiences are too painful, when emotions feel too overwhelming, we sometimes choose numbness over feeling. We build barriers of ice around our tender places, and we tell ourselves this is strength, this is wisdom, this is moving on. But frozen is not the same as healed. The water beneath the ice is still there, just held in a rigid form. The emotions we never allowed ourselves to feel do not disappear. They remain, locked away, taking up space, requiring energy to keep frozen. In Zen Buddhism, there is a teaching about meeting experience directly, without armor, without barriers. This does not mean being overwhelmed or consumed by our emotions. It means being willing to feel what is present, to acknowledge what is true, even when it is difficult. Riku's journey across the frozen lake represents the courage it takes to face our own frozen places. These might be old griefs we never fully mourned, angers we never expressed, fears we never admitted, truths we never spoke, parts of ourselves we rejected or hid away. The ice seems protective. It keeps us from feeling pain. But it also keeps us from feeling fully alive. It takes energy to maintain, and that energy is no longer available for being present to our lives as they actually are. The warmth Riku discovered was the warmth of his own awareness. When we bring conscious attention to our frozen places, when we acknowledge them rather than pretending they do not exist, something begins to shift. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. The way spring comes slowly to frozen ground, melting beginning at the edges, working its way deeper over time. The practice is simple, but requires courage. When we notice frozen places within us, we do not judge them or try to break them forcefully. We simply acknowledge them. We bring our warm breath of awareness to them. We stand willing to feel what has been kept at a distance. And we trust that warmth, applied patiently over time, can melt even the oldest ice. In a forest where ancient trees grew so tall their branches seemed to hold up the sky, there was a monastery that had existed for more generations than anyone could count. The buildings were made of dark wood that had weathered to a rich color, and moss grew on the northern sides of the walls, soft and green. Around the monastery, gardens had been cultivated with the same care as the meditation practice itself, each plant tended as if it were a living teaching. A monk named Isamu had lived at this monastery for 25 years. His particular responsibility was the garden, a role he had taken on not by assignment, but by natural inclination. Something about working with growing things spoke to him in ways that studying texts or sitting in formal meditation did not. The other monks recognized this and respected it, understanding that there are many ways to practice, many paths to the same understanding. Isamu's garden was unlike the formal temple gardens in the city. It was not designed for aesthetic perfection or symbolic meaning. It was a working garden, growing vegetables and herbs that fed the monastery through the seasons. But anyone who walked through it could feel that it was also something more. The way Isamu tended each plant, the attention he brought to the soil and the water and the seasons, turned ordinary gardening into something that approached art or prayer. One spring morning, as the last frost was giving way to warmer days and the first green shoots were emerging from the dark earth, a young monk named Takeo approached Isamu in the garden. Takeo had arrived at the monastery only 6 months earlier, and he was struggling with something that many new practitioners struggle with. He understood the teachings intellectually, could discuss Buddhist philosophy with clarity, but something was missing. A sense of depth, of real transformation, of the teachings actually changing him from the inside rather than just living in his head as ideas. Isamu was kneeling beside a bed of young seedlings, examining them with complete attention. When he heard Takeo approach, he looked up with a face that showed no irritation at being interrupted, just a quiet openness to whatever was needed. "Isamu," Takeo said, bowing respectfully. "May I speak with you about something that troubles me?" "Of course," Isamu replied, gesturing for Takeo to sit on the stone path beside the garden bed. Takeo sat, trying to find words for something he did not fully understand himself. I have been practicing for half a year now. I meditate every day. I study the teachings. I try to be mindful in my daily work. But I do not feel different. I do not feel transformed. I keep waiting for some moment of enlightenment, some experience that will change everything, but nothing happens. I feel the same as when I arrived, just more knowledgeable about Buddhist concepts. Isamu listened, his hands resting on his knees, his attention complete. When Takeo finished, Isamu smiled gently. "Come," he said, standing with the ease of someone whose body is accustomed to this kind of work. "Help me with the garden today. We can talk while we work." He led Takeo to a section of the garden where the soil had been turned but not yet planted. "This area will become our summer vegetables," Isamu explained. "Tomatoes, beans, squash. But first, the soil needs attention." He knelt and began pulling weeds that had sprouted among the turned earth, even though the main planting had not yet occurred. His movements were patient and thorough, ensuring he got the full root of each weed so it would not return. "These weeds," Isamu said as he worked, "they are like old habits, patterns of thinking and behaving that no longer serve us. Some are easy to pull with shallow roots. Others go deep and require careful attention to remove fully. If we just pull off the top but leave the root, they grow back stronger." Takeo knelt beside him and began pulling weeds as well, following Isamu's example of removing the entire root system rather than just the visible growth. "The garden teaches us something important," Isamu continued. "Growth happens in its own time. You cannot force a seed to sprout faster by pulling on it. You cannot make a plant grow to full size in a week because you are impatient. Each thing has its season, its natural pace." He moved to another bed where lilies were just beginning to push up through the soil, their shoots still small and pale. "These lilies have been here for years. Each spring they return, and each year they are more beautiful. But they require different care than the roses over there or the vegetables we are about to plant. Some need more water, some need less. Some need full sun, others prefer shade. There is no single method that works for everything." Takeo continued pulling weeds, beginning to see where this teaching was leading. "You speak of waiting for enlightenment," Isamu said, his voice gentle. "For some moment that will transform everything. But transformation is not usually a single moment. It is more like this garden. Small changes accumulated over time. Pulling weeds daily so they do not overtake the good plants. Watering consistently so the roots grow deep. Paying attention to what each part of you needs, what requires more care, what requires less." He stood and walked to a rose bush that showed signs of disease on some of its branches. "This rose is basically healthy, but these branches are sick. If I leave them, the disease will spread to the healthy parts." Sometimes in our practice, we need to prune away what is not serving us. Old relationships that feed our worst tendencies. Activities that drain us without nourishing anything real. Beliefs that limit us or cause suffering. With his pruning shears, he carefully cut away the diseased branches. His movements were decisive but not harsh, removing what needed to be removed while preserving the living plant. "But pruning is not the only work," Isamu continued. He led Takeo to a section where young seedlings grew in neat rows, barely an inch tall. "These are beginnings. New practices you are developing. new ways of seeing or being. They are fragile now and need protection and consistent care. But with time, with daily attention, they will grow strong. He knelt and gently watered the seedlings, the moisture soaking into the soil around their delicate roots. This is what practice is. Not one dramatic moment, but daily attention. Small acts of care, repeated faithfully, weeding the mind of unhelpful patterns, pruning away what harms, watering what you want to grow, protecting new growth until it becomes established. Takeo felt something shift in his understanding. He had been waiting for a thunderbolt, for some peak experience that would validate his practice. But Isamu was showing him something different. Practice was more like gardening than like lightning. Patient, consistent, attentive work over time, trusting the natural process of growth rather than trying to force immediate results. They worked together for several hours, moving through different tasks in the garden. Each task carried its teaching. When they built a trellis for climbing beans, Isamu spoke about how practice needs structure to support it. When they spread compost around established plants, he talked about how we need nourishment from teachings and teachers and community. When they simply sat in the late afternoon sun, looking at the garden they had tended, he said nothing, letting the peace of the moment speak for itself. As the evening approached and it was time to return to the monastery for the evening meal, Takeo bowed deeply to Isamu. "I understand better now," he said. "I was looking for harvest when I had barely planted the seeds. I wanted the garden to be complete when I had only just begun the work." Isamu smiled. The garden is never complete. Even in winter, when nothing seems to be growing, work is happening beneath the surface. The soil is resting, gathering strength for spring. Seeds are waiting for the right conditions. This is also practice. Sometimes the growth is visible, sometimes it is not. But the work continues, patient and faithful, through all seasons. They walked back to the monastery together, and Takeo felt a strange sense of relief. He did not need to be transformed overnight. He did not need to force some dramatic change. He just needed to tend his inner garden day by day, trusting that growth would come in its own time, according to its own nature. This teaching about inner gardening speaks to something essential in Zen Buddhism, the understanding that practice is not about dramatic achievements, but about consistent care. We often approach spiritual practice the way Takeo did, expecting some moment of enlightenment that will change everything suddenly and completely. When this does not happen, we become discouraged, thinking we are doing something wrong or that practice does not work. But Isamu shows us a different way of understanding. The garden grows slowly, through daily attention and care. No single day of watering makes the plants flourish. No single weeding session clears the garden forever. It is the patient accumulation of small acts performed faithfully over time that creates the conditions for growth. In our own practice, whether we call it meditation or mindfulness or simply paying attention to our lives, the same principle applies. We are tending an inner garden. Some days we pull weeds, noticing unhelpful thoughts or patterns and choosing not to feed them. Some days we water new growth, deliberately practicing kindness or patience or awareness. Some days we prune, letting go of what no longer serves us. Some days we simply sit with what we have cultivated, appreciating the current state of the garden without demanding it be different. The different plants in Isamu's garden, requiring different care, represent the different aspects of ourselves. Some parts need more attention, more gentleness, more time. Other parts are naturally vigorous and need space to grow without interference. There is no single technique that works for everything. We learn through attention and patience what each part of us needs. The young seedlings represent new practices, new ways of being that we are trying to cultivate. They are fragile at first. If we judge them for not being fully grown immediately, we discourage ourselves. If we stop caring for them because they do not show dramatic results right away, they wither. But if we protect them and tend them patiently, they gradually become established, and eventually they can flourish without such intensive care. And perhaps, most importantly, Isamu's teaching reminds us that the garden is never finished. There is no final state of perfection where we have nothing left to tend. Even in winter, when growth is invisible, the work continues beneath the surface. This is not a failure of practice. This is the nature of being alive, of having a mind, of being human. The tending continues through all seasons, and each season has its own beauty and its own requirements. In the mountains where peaks reached above the clouds, there was a practice that some monks followed, a practice of seeking balance between different kinds of understanding. A monk named Goro had dedicated himself to this practice, and it had shaped his life in ways that those who lived in a single place could not quite understand. Goro spent his mornings on the high slopes of the mountain, sometimes climbing to the very summit where the air was thin and the view extended for vast distances. Up there, among the rocks and snow and endless sky, he would sit in meditation. The concerns of daily life seemed very small from that height. Problems that felt overwhelming in the valley appeared insignificant from the peak. From up there, he could see patterns and connections that were invisible at ground level. The broad sweep of things, the big picture, the way everything fit together into a larger whole. But Goro did not stay on the mountain peak. Every afternoon, he would descend to the valley below, to the village where people lived their ordinary lives. There, he would work in simple ways, helping to repair a roof, sitting with someone who was grieving, playing with children in the street, sharing meals with families who opened their homes to him. In the valley, the concerns that seemed small from the mountain peak became immediate and real again. A mother's worry about her sick child, a farmer's anxiety about the harvest, an old person's loneliness. These were not small from the perspective of the people living them. They were everything, the entirety of their world in that moment. This rhythm of mountain and valley had become Goro's practice. Each morning, he would climb toward the peak, seeking the expansive view, the clarity that comes from height and distance. Each afternoon, he would return to the valley, to the particular and immediate, to the messy reality of human life with all its complications. One autumn, a young monk named Jiro came to study with Goro. Jiro had spent several years in intensive meditation practice, sitting for long hours, studying the nature of mind and consciousness. He had gained some genuine insight through this practice, but he felt something was incomplete. He had heard that Goro's way of moving between mountain and valley offered a more balanced path. On Jiro's first morning, Goro invited him to make the climb to the upper slopes. They began before dawn, walking in silence up the steep paths as the sky gradually brightened. It was hard work, the altitude making each breath precious, but eventually they reached a place where the mountain opened up into a wide vista. Below them, the valley spread out like a painting, the village barely visible in the morning mist. Above them, the sky was turning from grey to blue, and the first sunlight was touching the highest peaks. Goro sat on a flat rock and gestured for Jiro to sit nearby. They meditated together in silence as the sun rose fully and the day began in the world below. After an hour, Goro spoke. "From up here, what do you notice?" Jiro considered. "Everything seems connected. I can see how the river flows from the high snowmelt through the valley, how it feeds the fields and the village. I can see weather patterns forming, clouds gathering over distant peaks. Everything is part of a larger system." "Yes," Goro said. "This is the view from height. We see connections, patterns, the big picture. Our personal problems seem small from here. Our individual struggles appear as just small movements within a vast landscape. This perspective brings a certain kind of peace, a sense of spaciousness." They sat together in that spaciousness for a while longer. Then Goro stood. "Now we go down." The descent took longer than the ascent, requiring different muscles, different attention. By the time they reached the valley, it was afternoon, and the village was in the midst of its daily activity. Goro led Jiro to a house where an elderly woman lived alone. Her husband had died the previous year, and her children had moved to distant cities for work. She welcomed them with tea, and they sat in her small kitchen while she talked about her life, her loneliness, her small daily struggles. Later, they helped a farmer repair a fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree. The work was simple but physically demanding, and it required full attention to the immediate task at hand. The hammer, the nail, the piece of wood. Nothing else. That evening, as they walked back to Goro's simple dwelling on the outskirts of the village, Jiro was quiet, turning something over in his mind. "Teacher," he finally said, "I see what you are showing me, but I am confused. On the mountain, we see that individual problems are small, part of a larger pattern. We touch something vast and impersonal. But in the valley, we give our complete attention to these individual concerns, treating them as important and real. These seem contradictory. Which perspective is true?" Goro smiled. "Both are true. Neither is complete by itself." He pointed back toward the mountain they had climbed that morning. "Up there, we remember that we are part of something larger than our individual stories. Our suffering is not unique or personal in the way we think. It arises from conditions, like everything else. This view prevents us from becoming lost in our dramas, from believing our problems are the center of the universe." Then he gestured around at the village. "But down here, we remember that even though life operates according to vast patterns, each moment, each person, each small act of kindness or care matters completely to the person experiencing it. The mother's worry about her child is not less real because it is part of a universal pattern of parents worrying about children. It is her worry in this moment, and it deserves our complete attention and compassion." They continued walking, and Goro went on. "Some practitioners stay only on the mountain. They develop great insight into emptiness, into the constructed nature of the self, into the vastness of awareness. But they can become cold, detached, unable to meet suffering with warmth because they see it as ultimately unreal or unimportant. They have the view from height, but no grounding. Other practitioners stay only in the valley. They work hard, serving others, attending to needs. But they can become lost in the details, overwhelmed by the endless stream of suffering, exhausted because they cannot access the spaciousness that puts things in perspective. They have the immediate engagement, but no overview. Jiro walked in silence, beginning to understand. The complete practice, Goro said, is to move between both. To climb high enough to see the patterns and connections, to touch the vastness, to remember we are part of something larger than our individual stories. And then to descend back into the particular, to give our full attention and care to this specific moment, this specific person, this specific task, as if it were the only thing in the world. Over the following weeks, Jiro followed Goro's rhythm. Each morning, they would climb to the high places, sitting in the expansive view, meditating on the nature of mind and reality, touching something vast and impersonal. Each afternoon, they would return to the valley, engaging fully with whatever presented itself, giving complete attention to immediate needs and concerns. Gradually, Jiro began to feel a kind of balance developing. He could hold both perspectives at once. When he sat with someone in pain, he could be completely present to their suffering while also knowing it was part of a larger pattern. When he meditated on the vast nature of awareness, he could appreciate its spaciousness while also honoring the immediate reality of being a particular person in a particular moment. One evening, after several weeks of this practice, Jiro and Goro sat outside Goro's dwelling, watching the last light fade from the sky. The mountain peak was still visible, catching the sun's final rays while the valley below had already fallen into shadow. "I am beginning to understand," Jiro said quietly. "The mountain and the valley are not separate practices. They are two aspects of the same complete path. We need both the high view and the immediate engagement, both the spaciousness and the particular, both the recognition of patterns and the attention to this specific moment." "Yes," Goro said simply. "And notice how they support each other. The morning on the mountain gives you the spaciousness you need to work in the valley without being overwhelmed. The afternoon in the valley gives you the grounding and warmth you need, so your mountain practice does not become cold or abstract. Each makes the other possible." Jiro felt something settle inside him, a sense of completeness he had been seeking without knowing what was missing. He had been trying to live only at altitude, only in the vast view. But that had left him feeling disconnected from his own humanity, unable to fully engage with the messy reality of life as it is actually lived. Now, moving between mountain and valley, between the spacious view and the immediate particular, he felt more whole, more balanced, more capable of being both wise and warm, both clear and caring, both spacious and specific. This teaching about mountain and valley, about balancing different perspectives, addresses something crucial in spiritual practice. We often believe we must choose between different aspects of understanding, as if wisdom required abandoning one perspective for another. But Goro shows us that completeness comes from holding multiple perspectives, moving between them, allowing each to inform and balance the other. The mountain represents what we might call the absolute perspective. From that height, we see that all things are connected, that individual suffering arises from conditions rather than being personal or unique, that our separate self is a construction rather than an ultimate reality. This view is genuine and valuable. It prevents us from being completely lost in our dramas and problems. It gives us space and perspective. But the mountain alone is not enough. If we stay only at that altitude, we risk becoming detached, cold, unable to meet real suffering with real warmth. We might understand intellectually that suffering is impersonal, But that understanding does not help the person who is suffering right now. The view from the mountain, without the grounding of the valley, can become a way of avoiding the real demands of being human. But the valley alone can also become overwhelming. If we never climb to the mountain, never access the spacious view, we can become exhausted by the endless stream of needs and problems. We lose perspective and burn out, unable to sustain our engagement because we have no way to step back and see the larger pattern. The practice Goro offers is one of balance and movement. We climb to the mountain to access spaciousness, to touch something vast, to remember we are part of a larger whole. This refreshes us, gives us perspective, prevents us from drowning in the particulars. Then we descend to the valley to engage fully with what is actually here, to give our attention and care to specific moments and people, to honor the immediate reality of life as it is lived. Neither perspective cancels out the other. They complement each other, creating a complete path that is both wise and warm, both spacious and engaged, both clear about the nature of reality and fully present to the reality of this moment. This is the wisdom of moving between mountain and valley, between the vast view and the immediate particular, holding both as aspects of the same complete practice. On a mountain peak where snow remained through all seasons and clouds gathered like thoughts in the mind, there stood an ancient monastery carved partially into the rock itself. The monks who lived there were few, perhaps a dozen at any time, and they lived simply in the harsh climate, their practice focused and their days marked by long hours of meditation and study. A young monk named Saburo arrived at this monastery in his 23rd year. He came with impressive credentials, having studied at a prestigious temple in the capital where he had been recognized as one of the brightest students in his generation. His teachers there had praised his intelligence, his ability to grasp complex philosophical concepts, his skill in debate. He had memorized vast portions of the Buddhist canon and could discuss the subtlest points of doctrine with ease. When Saburo arrived at the mountain monastery, he carried with him not just his few possessions, but also a sense of his own accomplishment. He was aware that he knew more than most monks his age. He was proud of his understanding, his years of study, his intellectual achievements. He did not think of this as arrogance. He simply believed he was recognizing his own abilities accurately. The abbot of the monastery was an old monk named Fumio, perhaps 70 years old, with a face weathered by decades of mountain weather and eyes that seemed to hold depths that were difficult to fathom. When Saburo was brought to meet him, Fumio was sitting in a small room with a single window that looked out onto the snowy peaks. Saburo bowed respectfully and introduced himself, mentioning the temple where he had studied, the texts he had mastered, the recognition he had received from his teachers. Fumio listened quietly, his expression neutral. When Saburo finished, the old abbot simply nodded and said, "Come with me." He led Saburo through the monastery's stone corridors to a storage room where various items were kept. Fumio opened a wooden box and took out a single seed, so small it barely filled the hollow of his palm. "Do you know what this is?" Fumio asked. Saburo looked at the tiny seed. It was unremarkable, brown and oval, with no distinguishing features. "A seed," he said. "Perhaps from a cherry tree, or possibly a plum. Without seeing it grow, it is difficult to identify exactly." "It is a cherry seed," Fumio confirmed. "Tell me, what does this seed contain?" Saburo, pleased to demonstrate his knowledge, answered promptly. "It contains the genetic code for a complete cherry tree. All the information needed to grow roots, trunk, branches, leaves, flowers, and eventually more seeds. It contains the potential for the entire life cycle of the tree. Very good, Fumio said. You have studied well. He held the seed closer to Saburo. And tell me, is this seed valuable? In a sense, yes, Saburo replied. It has the potential to become a great tree. But by itself, without soil, water, sun, and time, it is just a seed. Its value lies in what it might become, not in what it currently is. Fumio smiled slightly, and something in that smile suggested the lesson had already begun, though Saburo did not yet recognize it. This seed will be your responsibility, Fumio said, pressing the small seed into Saburo's hand. Plant it. Care for it. Learn from it. When you understand what it has to teach you, come back and tell me. Saburo took the seed, somewhat puzzled by this assignment. He had expected to be given advanced teachings, to study rare texts, to engage in sophisticated philosophical discussions. But he had been given a seed to plant. It seemed too simple, almost childish. But he respected the abbot enough not to question the instruction. He found a place in the small courtyard where some soil had been gathered in a protected corner, sheltered somewhat from the harsh mountain weather. He planted the seed carefully, watering it, marking the spot so he would remember where it was. Days passed, then weeks. Saburo continued his meditation practice, his study of texts, his daily work around the monastery. But each day he would check the spot where he had planted the seed. Nothing appeared. The soil remained undisturbed. After a month, he began to feel impatient. Perhaps the seed was old and would not germinate. Perhaps the mountain climate was too harsh. He considered mentioning this to Fumio, but something stopped him. The abbot had given him this task for a reason, and Saburo sensed that the lesson involved more than just whether the seed would grow. 2 months passed. Still nothing. Saburo continued to water the spot, though he was beginning to feel somewhat foolish doing so. What was the point of watering bare soil? In his 3rd month at the monastery, something shifted in Saburo. He had been so focused on the seed, on waiting for it to show some sign of growth, that he had not noticed changes in himself. But one morning, during meditation, he realized that his mind had become quieter. The constant mental chatter that had always accompanied his thinking, the voice that commented on everything and judged and compared and analyzed, had diminished. Not entirely, but noticeably. He also noticed that he was listening differently to the other monks. Before, when someone spoke, he had immediately been formulating his response, preparing his contribution, thinking about what he knew about the topic. Now, he sometimes just listened, without needing to add anything, without needing to demonstrate his knowledge. At the end of the 3rd month, Saburo was checking the spot where he had planted the seed when he noticed the smallest green shoot, barely visible, pushing through the soil. It was so tiny that he had to kneel down to see it clearly. Just 2 small leaves, pale green and delicate, reaching toward the light. He felt a surge of unexpected joy. The seed had germinated. After 3 months of watering soil with no visible result, something had finally emerged. But then he stopped, looking more carefully at his own reaction. The seed had been growing the entire time. Just because he could not see it did not mean nothing was happening. Below the surface, in the darkness of the soil, roots had been developing, the seed coat had been breaking down, the embryonic plant had been gathering energy and preparing for emergence. All of this had been happening while he impatiently waited to see results. He went to find Fumio. The old abbot was in the meditation hall, sitting in silence. Saburo waited respectfully until Fumio opened his eyes. "The seed has sprouted," Saburo said. "Has it?" Fumio replied. "Or did it sprout 3 months ago and you are only now seeing the evidence?" Saburo felt something click into place. It has been growing the entire time. Just because I could not see it does not mean the work was not happening. Fumio nodded. "And what else have you learned?" Saburo considered carefully. "I learned that I cannot force the seed to grow faster by wanting it to. I cannot make it sprout by being impatient or by demonstrating how much I know about cherry trees. The seed grows according to its own nature in its own time. All I can do is provide the conditions, water, soil, protection, and then trust the process." "Yes," Fumio said. "And how does this relate to your practice?" Saburo was quiet for a long moment. "I came here full of knowledge, proud of my understanding, expecting to quickly master whatever teachings you would offer. But I see now that knowledge is like the seed before it is planted. It has potential, but by itself it is not the actual tree. Real understanding, real transformation requires time and patience. It requires me to simply do the work without constantly checking to see if I am making progress." Fumio smiled warmly. "The seed also teaches us humility. No matter how much the seed knows about being a tree, it must still go through the process of growth. It cannot skip steps. It cannot force the seasons. It must surrender to the natural unfolding, trusting that the wisdom encoded in it will express itself when conditions are right." He stood and walked to the window, gesturing for Saburo to join him. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and patient, covered in snow that would melt in time, giving way to brief summers before winter returned. "You came here with much knowledge," Fumio said gently. "But knowledge without humility becomes a barrier rather than a doorway. The practice is not about accumulating more understanding. It is about becoming like the soil that receives the seed, open, receptive, patient, willing to do the daily work of practice without demanding immediate visible results, trusting that the deep work is happening even when you cannot see it." Saburo bowed deeply. He understood now why Fumio had given him this particular teaching. His pride in his knowledge had been like a hard shell around the seed, preventing it from softening and opening. The 3 months of watering bare soil had been necessary, not for the seed's growth, but for his own transformation. He had learned to practice without the constant need for validation, without the requirement that his efforts show immediate results. "Continue to care for the tree," Fumio said. "It will take years to grow tall enough to bloom. But you do not need to wait years to understand the teaching. The teaching is here now, in the simple act of providing water and care without attachment to outcomes. This is the practice of humility." This teaching about the seed and the patient work of growth speaks to something essential in Zen Buddhism, the recognition that real transformation cannot be forced or hurried. We often approach practice the way Saburo initially did, with expectations of quick results, wanting to see evidence of our progress, needing validation that our efforts are working. But the seed teaches us differently. Most of its important work happens in darkness, unseen. The roots develop before any shoot appears above ground. The internal changes precede the external signs. If we judge the seed by what we can see in the first days or weeks after planting, we would conclude nothing is happening. But this conclusion would be false. In our own practice, the deepest changes often happen below the surface of our awareness. We sit in meditation day after day, sometimes feeling like nothing is happening, like we are not making progress. But something is developing in those hours of practice, even when we cannot see it. Patterns are slowly shifting. The mind is gradually becoming more familiar with stillness. Understanding is ripening at levels deeper than thought. The teaching of humility that Fumio offers is about releasing our need to control the pace of growth. Saburo arrived at the monastery with impressive knowledge, but that knowledge had become an obstacle. He was so identified with what he knew that he could not open to what he did not know. He needed to demonstrate his understanding constantly, which prevented him from the simple receptivity that real learning requires. The months of watering bare soil taught him to practice without constant feedback, without the need to see results that would validate his efforts. This is humility, continuing the daily work simply because it is the work, trusting the process even when we cannot see what it is producing. The seed also teaches us about natural timing. We cannot make a seed sprout faster by pulling on it or by being impatient. Each thing has its season, its natural pace of development. Some insights come quickly. Others take years to ripen. The practice is to provide the conditions, to do the daily work, and to trust that growth will happen according to its own nature. In a valley where a river carved its path through ancient rock, there was a small village where a Zen teacher named Ichiro had built a simple hermitage. The hermitage sat on a hillside where Ichiro could see the entire valley spread below, and at night the sky opened up with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Ichiro had lived in this hermitage for many years, and the villagers had come to know his rhythms. They noticed that he seemed to change with the moon. When the moon was new and dark, Ichiro would spend long hours in meditation, often sitting through the entire night in silence. When the moon was full and bright, he would be active in the village, teaching, helping with work, engaging with people. This pattern intrigued a young monk named Kenshin, who came to study with Ichiro one spring. Kenshin had been struggling with a question that had troubled him for years. He felt that his practice was inconsistent. Some weeks, he felt energized and clear, his meditation deep, and his understanding sharp. Other weeks, he felt dull and unfocused, his practice seeming to go nowhere. He had tried to maintain constant, steady effort, to practice with the same intensity every day, but he found this exhausting. He would push through his low periods with discipline, but then he would burn out and need to rest. This cycle frustrated him. He wanted to find a way to maintain steady, consistent practice without these ups and downs. One evening, shortly after arriving at the hermitage, Kenshin sat with Ichiro on the hillside, watching as the sun set and the first stars appeared. The moon was a thin crescent, just beginning its monthly cycle. "Teacher," Kenshin said, "I notice that your practice changes with the moon. Why is this? Should we not maintain steady effort regardless of external conditions?" Ichiro looked at the crescent moon, a slight smile on his face. "Tell me," he said, "does the moon apologize for waxing and waning? Does it feel it should remain always full?" "No," Kenshin replied. "The moon follows its natural cycle. It waxes toward fullness, then wanes back to darkness, then begins again. This is its nature. Yes, Ichiro said. And do you consider the waning moon inferior to the full moon? Is the darkness somehow a failure? Kenshin thought about this. No, both phases are necessary. The darkness allows the stars to be seen clearly. The full moon illuminates the night. Each has its purpose. Then why, Ichiro asked gently, do you judge your own natural cycles as problems to be solved? Kenshin felt something shift in his understanding, though he could not quite articulate it yet. Over the following weeks, Ichiro invited Kenshin to simply observe the moon each night and to notice his own inner states without trying to change them. When the moon was waxing, growing from crescent toward full, Kenshin noticed that he felt naturally more expansive, more energized, more inclined toward activity and engagement. When the moon was waning, moving from fullness back toward darkness, he felt more inward, more contemplative, more inclined toward silence and stillness. At first, Kenshin tried to maintain the same external practice regardless of these internal shifts. But Ichiro encouraged him to experiment with adapting his practice to match his inner season. When you feel expansive, Ichiro said, practice in ways that honor that expansion. Engage with teachings, work with the energy that is available. When you feel inward and quiet, honor that by going deeper into stillness, into silence. Do not fight against your natural rhythm. Kenshin began to follow this guidance. During his expansive phases, he would study texts, have discussions with Ichiro about teachings, work actively in the village. During his inward phases, he would spend long hours in meditation, sometimes sitting through much of the night as Ichiro did when the moon was dark. Something remarkable happened. Instead of feeling like he was failing during his quiet phases, Kenshin began to appreciate them. He noticed that the insights he gained during deep meditation in his inward times would later inform his more active practice. And the energy and engagement of his expansive times would give him something to reflect on and integrate during his quiet times. One evening, when the moon was approaching fullness, Kenshin and Ichiro sat on the hillside again. The valley below was bathed in silver light, every detail visible in the moon's brightness. I am beginning to understand, Kenshin said. I have been judging my natural cycles, thinking that the quiet, inward times were somehow inferior to the energized, expansive times. I have been trying to force myself to be always active, always making visible progress. But this goes against my natural rhythm. Ichiro nodded. The moon does not try to remain always full. It completes its entire cycle, trusting that the waning is as necessary as the waxing. The darkness prepares for the light. The fullness gives way to emptiness, so that fullness can come again. He pointed to the bright moon above them. Right now, the moon is nearly full. Its light is strong and illuminates everything. But this moment of fullness is only possible because the moon first went through darkness. And this fullness will give way to waning and eventually to darkness again, and then the cycle will begin once more. So I should trust the cycle, Kenshin said. When I feel inward and quiet, instead of fighting it or judging it as lack of progress, I should go deeper into it, knowing that this phase serves its purpose. And when I feel expansive and energized, I should use that energy fully, knowing it too will pass and give way to another inward time. Yes, Ichiro said. This is practicing with wisdom rather than against your nature. Some students try to maintain the same practice every day, the same energy, the same effort. But this is exhausting and goes against the natural rhythm of being alive. We are not machines that can run at constant speed. We are more like the moon, or like seasons, or like tides. We have natural cycles of expansion and contraction, of activity and rest, of outward engagement and inward reflection. Over the months that followed, Kenshin learned to recognize his own cycles more clearly. He noticed that they roughly followed the moon, though not exactly. Sometimes his inward phases lasted longer. Sometimes his expansive phases were briefer. But instead of fighting these variations, he learned to work with them. When his practice felt deep and powerful, he did not attach to that state or try to make it permanent. He knew it would shift. When his practice felt dull or difficult, he did not despair or judge himself as failing. He knew this phase would also pass, giving way to something different. One night, during a new moon when the sky was completely dark and filled with stars, Kenshin sat in meditation with a depth he had never experienced before. The darkness outside matched a darkness within, not a negative darkness but a profound stillness, like the stillness at the bottom of a deep well. In that darkness, something clarified. He saw that he had been fighting against life itself, trying to be always one way when life requires us to be many ways. He had been trying to be always summer when winter also has its gifts. When he emerged from meditation and found Ichiro sitting outside looking at the stars, Kenshin bowed deeply. "Thank you," he said simply. "I understand now. The cycles are not obstacles to practice. They are the practice. Learning to move with them, to honor each phase, to trust the natural rhythm, this is wisdom." Ichiro smiled in the darkness. "Yes. And now you can stop exhausting yourself trying to be the full moon at all times. You can be what you are in each moment, trusting that the cycle will continue, that what wanes will wax again, that darkness and light both serve the path." The teaching of the waxing and waning moon speaks to something we often resist, the natural cycles of our energy, attention, and capacity. We live in a culture that values constant productivity, steady effort, unchanging performance. We judge ourselves when we have low energy or when our practice feels less inspired. We think something is wrong when we go through quiet, inward periods. But the moon teaches us differently. Its waning is not a failure. Its darkness is not inferior to its brightness. Each phase of the cycle serves a purpose. The darkness allows us to see stars that are invisible when the moon is full. The waning teaches us about letting go, about the natural process of things dissolving and emptying. The waxing shows us about building, gathering, moving toward fullness. In Zen Buddhism, there is an understanding that practice must be sustainable, which means it must honor natural rhythms rather than fight against them. Some days, some weeks, even some months, we will feel inspired and clear and deeply engaged with practice. Other times, practice will feel dull or difficult, and we might need to simply maintain basic continuity rather than expecting profound breakthroughs. Kenshin's mistake was thinking that the energized times were good and the quiet times were bad. He exhausted himself trying to maintain constant high energy, and then he would collapse. But when he learned to recognize and honor his natural cycles, his practice became sustainable. The quiet times became opportunities for deep integration rather than periods to push through with discipline. The expansive times became opportunities to fully use available energy rather than times to hoard energy in fear that it would run out. The wisdom here is about trusting the cycle. When we are in fullness, we practice fullness without trying to make it permanent. When we are in emptiness, we practice emptiness without despairing that fullness will never return. Each phase prepares for the next. The tree that sheds its leaves in autumn is not dying, it is preparing for spring. The practitioner who goes through a quiet period is not regressing, they are integrating and preparing for the next phase of growth. This is the teaching of natural cycles, showing us how to practice with the grain of our nature rather than against it, trusting that what wanes will wax again and what empties will fill once more. In the mountains where ancient pines grew tall and straight, there was a monastery known for its extensive library. The building that housed this library was separate from the main temple, constructed of stone with high ceilings and tall windows that let in the northern light. Shelves lined every wall, filled with scrolls and bound texts collected over centuries. Some were Buddhist sutras, others were commentaries by famous masters, and still others were philosophical works from various traditions. A young monk named Masaru had recently arrived at this monastery. He was 26 years old and had spent the previous 5 years traveling to different temples, studying with different teachers, collecting teachings the way some people collect treasures. He had notebooks filled with insights he had copied down, practices he had learned, wisdom he had gathered from masters across the region. Masaru loved the library. He would spend hours there, reading texts, taking notes, absorbing the accumulated wisdom of generations of practitioners. He felt that by studying what others had discovered, he could avoid making mistakes, could accelerate his own understanding, could benefit from the insights that had taken others lifetimes to achieve. The head librarian was an old monk named Takashi, who had tended the library for 40 years. Takashi was perhaps 65 years old, with fingers stained from handling ancient ink and eyes that showed the fatigue of decades spent in dim light reading small characters. But his presence had a quality of quiet contentment, as if he had found something in his work that went deeper than the words he catalogued. One afternoon, Masaru was in the library reading a commentary on the Diamond Sutra, taking careful notes as always. Takashi was organizing recently acquired texts, placing them in their proper locations on the shelves. "Takashi," Masaru said, looking up from his reading, "I have been thinking about something. I have studied with many teachers, read many texts, collected so many teachings. But sometimes I wonder if I am really understanding anything or just filling my mind with other people's words. How do I know which teachings are true? How do I distinguish genuine wisdom from mere cleverness?" Takashi stopped his work and looked at Masaru with gentle eyes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Come with me. There is something I want to show you." He led Masaru to a section of the library that was rarely visited, where the oldest texts were kept. These were documents so fragile that they were only handled with great care and only when absolutely necessary. Takashi unlocked a wooden cabinet and carefully removed something wrapped in silk cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a book. But when Masaru looked at it, he saw something strange. The book was bound in leather, its pages made of good quality paper, but when Takashi opened it and began turning the pages, Masaru saw that they were completely blank. Every page was empty, unmarked by ink or any kind of writing. "What is this?" Masaru asked, puzzled. "This," Takashi said softly, "is the most important book in our library. It has been here longer than any text we possess. Every abbot who has served this monastery has known about it, and each has passed the knowledge to his successor. Masaru looked at the blank pages, confused. But there is nothing written in it. How can it be important? Takashi carefully closed the book and held it so Masaru could see the worn leather cover. This book is empty because it is waiting. It has been waiting for centuries, and it will continue to wait. It represents something that cannot be found in any text, no matter how profound or ancient. He handed the book to Masaru, who took it carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The leather was soft with age, the binding solid, but showing signs of its years. "You come to the library every day," Takashi said, "and you read the words of masters who lived hundreds of years ago. You copy their insights into your notebooks. You memorize their teachings. This is not wrong. There is value in learning from those who practiced before us. But tell me, whose life are you living?" Masaru opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. He was not sure how to respond to this question. "The words in these books," Takashi continued, gesturing around at the filled shelves, "are the words of people who looked deeply into their own experience. They sat with their own minds. They faced their own fears and desires. They discovered their own understanding through their own practice. The books record what they found, but the books are not the finding itself. They are like maps of journeys that other people took." He took the empty book back from Masaru and opened it again to its blank pages. "This book represents the journey you have not yet taken, the understanding you have not yet discovered, the insights that can only come from your own direct experience, not from reading about someone else's experience." Masaru felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. "But surely we should learn from those who came before us. Why reinvent what has already been discovered?" "Yes, we learn from them," Takashi agreed. "We study their methods, we understand their insights. But then we must close the books and live our own lives. We must face our own experience directly. We must fill our own empty book with what we discover, not with copies of what others discovered." He placed the empty book back in its silk wrapping. Every person who practices sincerely will eventually need to stop reading about the path and actually walk it. Every genuine practitioner will have to close the books of others and open their own empty book. This is not rejecting the teachings. It is completing them by making them your own through direct experience. Over the following weeks, Masaru found himself spending less time in the library. Takashi's words had planted something in him, a question that would not go away. He began to notice how much of his practice consisted of comparing his experience to what he had read in books. When he sat in meditation, he was often checking to see if his experience matched what the texts described. When difficulties arose, he would search through his notes for what some master had said about such difficulties rather than meeting the difficulty directly. One evening, Masaru approached Takashi in the library. The old librarian was working by lamplight, as he often did in the evening hours. "Takashi," Masaru said, "I have been thinking about the empty book. I understand what you were showing me. I have been living through other people's words, using their insights as a substitute for my own experience. But I do not know how to begin filling my own empty book. Where do I start?" Takashi smiled. "You have already started. The recognition itself is the first mark on the first page. The acknowledgement that you have been living someone else's story instead of your own." He set down the catalogue he had been working on. "The practice is simple. Each day, Notice what is actually present in your experience, not what the books say should be present. When you sit in meditation and find your mind restless, do not immediately consult a text about restlessness. Just sit with the restlessness itself. See what it actually is in your direct experience. This seeing, this direct meeting of your own experience, this is how you write in your empty book. But what if I discover nothing profound? Masaru asked. What if my own experience is mundane compared to the insights of great masters? Your experience is your experience, Takashi said gently. It may not be dramatic or extraordinary. Most of life is not. But it is real, and it is yours. A simple, honest recognition that comes from your own direct seeing is worth more than 1,000 profound insights copied from books. Masaru began to practice differently. Instead of always reaching for texts and teachings, he started to simply notice what was actually happening in his experience. When sadness arose, instead of remembering what various masters had written about sadness, he just felt the sadness, noticed where it lived in his body, observed how it changed moment to moment. When joy appeared, he met it directly rather than through concepts about joy. This was harder than he expected. Without the structure of teachings to rely on, without the validation of recognizing his experience in authoritative texts, he felt uncertain. Was he doing it right? Was what he noticed valuable? He had to learn to trust his own seeing, his own direct contact with reality, without the constant reference to external authority. Months passed. Masaru continued his practice of meeting his experience directly. Slowly, something shifted. He began to notice things he had never read about in any text. Small recognitions that were specific to his particular mind, his particular conditioning, his particular way of being. These insights were not dramatic or likely to become famous teachings. They were just honest observations about how his mind worked, what patterns he carried, what freed him, and what bound him. One evening, he returned to Takashi in the library. "I am beginning to understand," he said. "The empty book is not really empty. It is full of potential, waiting for me to discover what is already there. My experience is the text. My practice is the reading of it. And the insights that come from genuine attention to my own experience, these are the words that fill the pages." Takashi nodded with approval. "Yes. And now you understand why this empty book is the most important book in the library. Because it represents the book that each person must write for themselves. We can read all the wisdom in the world, but until we discover our own wisdom through our own experience, we are just borrowing other people's clothes." This teaching about the empty book speaks to something crucial in Zen Buddhism, the recognition that genuine understanding must be discovered firsthand, not just learned secondhand. We can study teachings, memorize sutras, understand concepts intellectually. All of this has value. But at some point, we must close the books and open ourselves to direct experience. Masaru's habit of constant study and note-taking was a form of avoidance. By always reading about practice rather than actually practicing, by always checking his experience against what texts said it should be, he was living at a distance from his own life. He was trying to have someone else's realization rather than his own. The empty book represents the untold story of our own direct experience. It cannot be filled by copying from other books. It can only be filled by honest attention to what is actually present in our own experience. This does not mean rejecting all teachings or thinking we need to discover everything from scratch. We learn methods, we understand principles, we benefit from the accumulated wisdom of the tradition. But then we must apply these to our own experience and discover for ourselves what is true. In Zen, there is a famous saying about not mistaking the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. The teachings are like fingers pointing, showing us where to look. But we must actually look. We must see the moon with our own eyes. Reading about the moon, memorizing descriptions of the moon, collecting teachings about the moon, none of this is the same as actually seeing it. The practice Takashi points to is about developing trust in our own direct seeing. When we notice something in our experience, we do not immediately check whether it matches what we have read or what teachers have said. We simply stay with what we are actually noticing. We allow ourselves to discover, to see, to understand through our own awareness rather than through borrowed concepts. This takes courage because it means releasing the security of authority, of knowing we are getting it right because we match our experience to authoritative descriptions. But it leads to genuine understanding, to insights that are truly our own because they arose from our own honest attention to our own experience. In a valley where villages were connected by dirt roads and travelers were common, there was a remote settlement where life moved slowly according to the rhythms of farming and fishing. At the edge of this village, in a small dwelling built of river stone, lived a Zen teacher named Gentaro. He was perhaps 50 years old, with a weathered face and hands that showed decades of manual work. Gentaro was known throughout the region, not for any dramatic teachings or impressive credentials, but for a simple practice he maintained. Each morning before dawn, he would walk to the village well, a structure that had served the community for as long as anyone could remember. The well was deep, its water cold and clear, fed by an underground spring that never ran dry even in the driest summers. Gentaro would lower the wooden bucket on its rope until it touched the water far below, then draw it up filled with fresh water. He would perform this task with complete attention, as if it were a sacred ritual rather than a simple chore. Villagers who saw him noticed that he never seemed hurried, never distracted, always completely present to the act of drawing water from the well. A young monk named Yuji came to study with Gentaro one autumn. Yuji had been practicing for several years and had some experience with meditation and study. But he felt something was missing. He had heard that Gentaro's teaching was different, more direct somehow, and he hoped to discover what he was lacking. When Yuji arrived and asked to study with Gentaro, the teacher simply nodded and said, "Tomorrow morning, before dawn, come with me to the well." The next morning, while stars still filled the sky and the village slept, Yuji met Gentaro at his dwelling. They walked together through the quiet streets to the well, their footsteps the only sound. At the well, Gentaro gestured for Yuji to look down into its depths. Yuji leaned over the stone rim and peered into the darkness below. He could see nothing. The well was so deep that the water was invisible in the darkness. "What do you see?" Gentaro asked. "Nothing," Yuji replied. "It is too dark. The water is too far down." Gentaro nodded. He took the rope and lowered the bucket slowly, hand over hand, until after what seemed a long time, they heard the splash of wood meeting water far below. Then Gentaro began pulling the rope up, his movements steady and unhurried. Eventually, the bucket appeared, filled with clear, cold water. Gentaro poured some into a cup and offered it to Yuji. "Drink." Yuji drank. The water was clean and cold, refreshing after the walk through the cool morning air. "This well has been here longer than anyone can remember," Gentaro said, coiling the rope. "Generation after generation has drawn water from it. In summer and winter, in times of plenty and times of scarcity, the water is always here, always the same quality, always available to those who lower the bucket." He looked at Yuji directly. "Tell me, where does this water come from?" "From an underground spring," Yuji said, "that feeds the well from below." "Yes." "Deep beneath the surface, hidden from sight, there is a source. We cannot see it. We cannot directly access it. But when we lower the bucket far enough, the water fills it, and we can bring it up to where it is needed." Over the following days, Yuji accompanied Gentaro on his daily visits to the well. Each morning, the same practice. Lower the bucket into the unseen depths. Draw it up filled with fresh water. Each time, Gentaro would perform this task with the same complete attention, as if it were the first time. After a week, Gentaro asked Yuji to draw the water himself. Yuji took the rope and lowered the bucket, feeling it descend into the darkness. When he heard the splash and felt the bucket fill, he drew it up, surprised at how much effort it took to raise the filled bucket from such a depth. "It is heavy," Yuji observed as he lifted the bucket over the rim of the well. "Yes," Gentaro said. "The deeper the source, the more effort required to bring it to the surface. But the water from deep sources is always pure, always fresh, because it has been filtered through layers of stone and earth." He took the bucket and poured water into 2 cups, handing one to Yuji. They drank together in the quiet morning. "You came here seeking teaching," Gentaro said after a moment. "You have been to other teachers, studied other practices. You have accumulated knowledge about Buddhism, about meditation, about the path. But tell me, have you found the well within yourself?" Yuji was not sure how to answer. "Most practitioners," Gentaro continued, "spend their time at the surface. They skim the top layer of awareness, working with their obvious thoughts and emotions, their surface reactions and patterns. This work has value. But it is like drawing water from a puddle rather than from a well. The puddle is easy to access, but it is shallow, easily disturbed, and it dries up in difficult times." He gestured toward the well. "The deep well requires more effort to access. You must lower the bucket through layers of the more obvious, through the familiar territory of ordinary consciousness. But when you reach the depth, what you find there is pure and inexhaustible. This is what Zen points to, the deep source within awareness itself." Over the following weeks, Gentaro taught Yuji how to access this inner depth. It was not complicated or esoteric. It simply required patience and consistent practice. In meditation, instead of staying with the surface movements of mind, the passing thoughts and sensations, Yuji learned to let his attention sink deeper, like the bucket descending into the well. Not forcing, not trying to achieve something special, just allowing his awareness to settle into its own depth. At first, this was difficult. Yuji's attention would get caught on surface activities. Thoughts would hook him and pull him into distraction. But gradually, as he practiced daily, he began to recognize a difference between surface mind and something deeper. There was a quality of awareness that was beneath the constant movement, beneath the stream of thoughts and reactions. It was like the water in the well, always present, always clear, always available when he remembered to lower the bucket deep enough to reach it. One morning, After several weeks of practice, Yuji sat in meditation before dawn. His attention sank through the usual layers of thinking, through the familiar patterns of his mind, down into something he had not quite recognized before. A depth of awareness that was present before thoughts formed, before reactions arose. It was not blank or empty in the sense of being nothing. It was more like a fullness, a presence, an awareness that was aware of itself. He sat with this for a long time, not trying to understand it or name it, just resting in the direct experience of this depth. When he finally opened his eyes, the sky was lightening with the approach of dawn. He found Gentaro at the well, as always, drawing water for the day. Yuji stood watching, and something about the simple act of lowering the bucket and drawing up water from the hidden source below struck him as a perfect teaching. This is what practice is, consistently returning to the depth, drawing from the inner source, bringing that clarity and freshness to the surface where it is needed. "Teacher," Yuji said, approaching the well, "I think I am beginning to understand. The well is within. The source is always there, always fresh, always available. But I must make the effort to go deep enough to reach it. I cannot just skim the surface and expect to draw from the deepest water." Gentaro nodded, a smile on his weathered face. "Yes. And now you understand why I come here every morning. Not just to get water for daily use, but to remember, to practice the movement from surface to depth, to stay connected to the source that never runs dry." He handed Yuji the bucket. "Your practice now is to find this well within yourself every day. Lower the bucket through the layers of surface activity. Reach the depth. Draw from it. Bring that clarity and freshness into your daily life. This is not separate from your life. This is the nourishment that makes life possible." Yuji took the bucket and lowered it into the well, feeling it descend into the darkness, hearing the splash as it met the water far below. As he drew it up, feeling the weight of it, he understood that this simple act contained everything he needed to know about practice. The depth is always there. We just need to remember to lower the bucket far enough to reach it. This teaching about the deep well speaks to something that distinguishes Zen Buddhism from more surface-level approaches to practice. It is not enough to work only with our obvious thoughts and emotions, our surface reactions and patterns. While this work has value, genuine transformation requires accessing a deeper level of awareness, the source that feeds all of our experience. Gentaro's daily practice of drawing water from the well is a perfect image for meditation practice. We must lower the bucket of attention through the layers of surface activity. Thoughts, reactions, habitual patterns, all of these are like the upper levels of the well. They are easily accessible, but also easily disturbed, changing constantly with conditions. Below this surface activity lies something deeper, more stable, more fundamental. This depth is not something we create or achieve. It is already present, like the water in the well. But it requires effort to access, not because it is far away, but because we are habitually identified with surface activity. We mistake the ripples for the water, the passing thoughts for awareness itself. The practice is to consistently return to this depth, not just once, but daily, the way Gentaro returned to the well each morning. Each time we sit in meditation, we lower the bucket again. Each time we remember to settle into deeper awareness during our daily activities, we are drawing from this inner source. What we find in this depth is something that does not run dry. Surface pleasures and pains come and go. Surface thoughts and emotions arise and pass. But the depth of awareness itself remains constant, always fresh, always clear, always available when we remember to access it. This is the teaching of the deep well, reminding us that within our own awareness lies a source of clarity and freshness that is inexhaustible. We just need to make the daily effort to lower the bucket, to go beneath the surface, to draw from the depth that is always there, always waiting, always ready to nourish our practice and our lives. As this night deepens and we approach the threshold of sleep, may these teachings settle gently into your awareness like water sinking into earth. The stories we have walked through together point to truths that are simple but profound. Truths about presence and acceptance, about cycles and growth, about the depths that lie within your own awareness. You do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to analyze or understand completely. These teachings work on you quietly, the way water works on stone, gradually, patiently, over time. Let them rest in you as you rest in this moment, this breath, this gentle movement towards sleep and renewal. The path continues tomorrow and all the days after. But for now, there is only this settling, this release, this trust in the natural process of rest and restoration. Let yourself be held by the silence, the way the valley is held by the mountains, the way the moon is held by the sky. And may you rest deeply in the awareness that has always been here, waiting beneath the surface, clear and fresh and inexhaustible, your own inner well, your own source of peace. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Monk.